inheritance law, coverage disputes, Jewish law, and arbitration. The breadth of his work in the fields of both American and Jewish law provides the ideal backdrop for us to learn here and now about his thoughts on the foundations of Jewish law, particularly in comparison with American. The topic of his lecture is therefore a very fundamental one. Is halakha Jewish law? The answer is more complicated than you think. Professor Simon, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and speaking to us tonight. We are looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Dear Professor Simon, Spektabilität, Dean Professor Dunn, dear colleague Dr. Baumel for the Rabbinical Seminary, dear Rabbi Spinner, dear colleague Professor Heger for the Berlin Studies on Jewish Law at HU, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Präsidium of Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, I'm delighted to warmly welcome, and I mean it in the sense of the word today, warmly welcome you today to the 2026 Hildesheimer Lecture. The Hildesheimer Lecture were founded 13 years ago by the Berlin Studies in Jewish Law in collaboration with the Rabbinical Seminary of Berlin. The aim was and remains to invite globally important voices on Jewish law from all corners of the world to the Senate Hall at Humboldt University, so that they may discuss fundamental questions of Jewish law and the ethics based upon it. Humboldt Universität has thus become a place where more than 90 years after the burning of books on the Berliner Opernplatz, right here on our right side of the street, Jewish legal scholars are bringing back their knowledge to Berlin. Today, we look at the August-Bebel-Platz as a place to remember this act of barbarism, which was only one of the first signs of unprecedented crimes against humanity, the Holocaust. The list of previous speakers is long. It began in autumn 2013. It was already mentioned by Chief Rabbi of Europe, Pinkas Goldschmidt, followed by numerous other chief rabbis, for example, from the United Kingdom and South Africa, professors of Jewish law from Israel and the USA, such as Professor Chaim Simon this year, as well as legal practitioners who as solicitors or judges have also dealt with issues of Jewish law and its coexistence with state law. In this way, the Hildesheimer Lecture makes an important contribution to the program of lectures on Jewish law at Humboldt-Universität and by extension in Berlin. At the same time, they exemplify to a particular degree the cooperation between university institutions, such as the Berlin Studies of Jewish Law, and non-university teaching and research institutions, such as the Berlin Rabbinical Seminary, which has been expanded since 2009 and stands in the tradition of the Hildesheimer Seminary, closed by the Nazis in 1938. The Rabbinical Seminary is thus continuing the teaching of Jewish law, which has been practiced in Berlin since 1873 and was renowned worldwide at the time in cooperation with the Berlin Studies of Jewish Law. And it is, like I said earlier this month, it's a celebratory lecture for 30 years of Berlin Studies on Jewish law. The exploring of Jewish law has also an important role bringing Jewish life back into our society. Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin therefore strongly supports the establishment and expansion of courses on Jewish law here in Berlin's Mitte district. This fits perfectly into the overall program of courses on the relationship between law and religion, which is to be further expanded in future by all participating institutions in collaboration with their partner institutions. In this context, the annual Hildesheimer lecture plays a central role. And now I'm very much looking forward to the lecture of this year, and I'm glad for having you here tonight, Professor Simon. Thank you for your attention.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Simon, it is now my pleasure and great honor to welcome you here in the Senate Hall of Humboldt University as the Dean of the University's Faculty of Law. As we heard, since 2013, so 13 years, the Hildesheimer Lectures are co-organized by today's Rabbinical Seminary of Berlin, together with the Berlin Studies in Jewish Law at our faculty. They have brought and bring world-known authorities in Jewish law to our university. They highlight the relevance of Jewish legal thought in the world, and they also showcase how much our faculty aims to advance interdisciplinary and international research and exchange. That way, the annual Hildesheimer Lectures are an important component of our faculty's calendar, and we are especially happy to have you here tonight on this warm day. I will not go into any details regarding the lectures. Some of them have already been mentioned since 2013. Also not mention the older tradition dating back to 1873. But I do want to mention two important events that paved the way for the recreation of these lectures. In 2010, on the occasion of the 200-year anniversary of Humboldt University, which, as you can know, then in 1810 was founded as the Berlin University. On that occasion, Rabbi David Bleich received the honorary doctorate of our faculty, which is a very rare honor to be handed over. And in his reception speech, he laid out important bioethical questions of law, so already starting the exchange on law and questions of legal thought in this normative setting. Also, I want to mention in 2013, Rabbi Blanchard, who played a pivotal role in creating the studies and carrying it through the years, gave a speech at the memorial event organized by the Faculty of Law, together with the theological faculty, commemorating 80 years since the book burning, as already mentioned, just across the street. And the other last event that I want to mention is last year's lecture by the president of Yeshiva University in New York, who spoke to us and reminded us of the very close connections between Yeshiva University and its Cardozo Law School and Humboldt University. And this is one of the really foundations of the Berlin studies of Jewish law, so that close cooperation, I think, started by Professor Bernhard Schlink. I don't want to go any further. I just want to end by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers of the lectures, to Martin Heger representatively, and to its speakers. The lectures really do highlight the international and interdisciplinary interest at our faculty. And the connection between law and religion obviously is one of the most profound and most complex interdisciplinary connections in this sense. And so I'm very much looking forward to your lecture tonight, Professor Simon.
Thank you all for such a warm lecture and reception. It's a little daunting. I wasn't planning on it until a few days ago, but because everyone started with some history, I want to start with some of my own family history in connection to Berlin and to the Hildesheimer Seminary itself. So these are my grandparents, Dr. Kuna Roth and my grandmother Tilda Roth. He was born in Poland, but moved as a very young child to Oberhausen, and then to Frankfurt, and then to Berlin. And my grandmother was born in Munich, and they got married in 1936, and then moved to Berlin. They left after Kristallnacht in 38 or 39, and eventually went to Israel. Now, the reason I know where they live is because my grandfather was a dentist and had studied and taken the exams in Frankfurt. But he then had a sign when he opened his business, and I'm going to mess up the German, but he called himself a Zahnarzt, which I believe is like a doctor of dental medicine. The Nazi regime did not allow him to do that because he was not a member of the guild, because he was not qualified, because he wasn't a citizen. So our family has a series of correspondences back and forth where he's saying, no, I passed the exams, and they're saying no, and he had to take down the sign and then put up the sign as dentist. Because of that, I know exactly where he lives. It's Oranienburger 40, which I went to go see today, earlier yesterday, and connected me to a part of my own history that I sort of knew only broadly, but not well before. I don't know why this guy messed up here. The other connections to the seminar itself, which is my grandfather studied in the yeshiva in Frankfurt under Joseph Breuer. And when he left, he got this letter basically saying that he's a chaver, which is like a member in good standing in the German Jewish kehillah. And it's written here to the community, to the Adas community in Berlin. And through that, he got to know Rabbi Yechiel Weinberg, who was the last dean, the rector of the rabbinical seminary in the pre-war period. My grandmother told me that they didn't give Rabbi Weinberg, he lived in West Berlin, and the yeshiva was here close by, and during the afternoon when they had the Schlafstunde, they didn't have a room for him. So he would sleep at my grandparents' house, and that's how they had this connection. So, now, as I was thinking, hearing all the history, I could only imagine if, my grandparents were alive, to see that their grandson here in Berlin in the university, I think it would have been literally mind-blowing for them. But I hope that I can do some justice to their legacy. Okay, so with that history out of the way, I started to ask, is halakha Jewish law, and why that's a more complicated question than we may think. So I want to start by maybe, before we make it a complicated question, to make it an easy question, which is, look, anyone who's been in a Jewish home, or an observant home, you'll open the cabinets and you'll see not one, but two sets of dishes. If you dig a little bit more, you might find two other sets of dishes, so milk and meat, and then of course for Passover, milk and meat. And if you ask, gosh, why do you need 4 sets of dishes? They will tell you, well, because Jewish law requires it. I was here over Shabbat, and by about 10:15, I was quite tired. But the evening prayers could not start before 10:54 in the June solstice. And when you ask what sort of crazy people wait until 11 p.m. to conclude the day, it says, well, there's a legal definition of night. It has to do with the stars and the degree of the sun. And yeah, in Northern Europe, in the summer, it's going to be very late. But why not do it at 6 or 7 like a normal? And the answer is because that's what the law requires. So Judaism, as we all know, has many, many rules. But I think there's something deeper. Because if one, and I teach at Villanova Law School, which is a Christian Catholic university, now when you hear in that context, and you say, okay, what does it mean to sort of act religiously or through religious conviction in the world, you're going to hear a lot of different terms. Moral theology, Christian ethics, virtues, Catholic social thought. In a more Protestant term, you might hear discipleship, Christian formation, living faith. Each of these words connotes a desire to live life in a religious framework. But notably, none of them are framed as law. By contrast, within Judaism, people are liking to say, we're practicing Jewish law, or practicing halakha, or we're living God's commandments. There's obviously a legal centrality to it. So, to maybe slightly reframe the question, Jewish law is obviously law, but the question is what else is it? Because what I want to complicate this question a little bit, because a lot of parts of Jewish law and practices of Judaism make no sense if we only think of it as law, particularly the way we think of law in a law school setting. Now, in modern situations, almost all law falls into one of two categories. Either what we might call primary rules of conduct, directly regulating behavior to curtail wrongdoing. Criminal law fits into this, tort law fits into this. These are the rules that say don't do things or do certain things in order to guide behavior. Now then, legal theorists will tell you that there's a second type of law, which we might call coordinating rules. In other words, rules that create rules. Rules of how to form a corporation that will eventually dictate behavior. Rules of how to form a contract, which will eventually govern the parties' behavior. Rules of how to create legislation and constitutions, which eventually do that. In other words, these are rules that create structure to channel and regulate behavior. Now, all this is quite terrestrial and of the here and now, and therefore designed to govern and regulate society. Because of that, the idea of law in a place without people, without society, we'll call it in heaven, is almost always in the Anglo-American tradition a joke, a reductio ad absurdum. I want to start by looking at 3 examples of the law in heaven from the a little bit German and the Anglo-American tradition, precisely to show that every time it's used as something that's obviously not correct. Now, because we're in Berlin, I wanted to start with a quote that a very famous American law professor in the 30s, Felix Cohen, in a very famous article called Transcendental Nonsense and the Functional Approach, which still today is one of the 40 top law reviews cited ever in the American canon. But he starts with Rudolf von Jhering, who I understand had some connection to Berlin, the archenemy of the Pantheist conceptual jurisprudence, the father of, or a father of sociological jurisprudence. And Cohen begins his article, foundational to this day, quoting Jhering. And he says as follows: some 50 years ago, a great German jurist had a curious dream. He dreamed that he died and was taken to a special heaven reserved for theoreticians of the law. In this heaven, one found the many concepts of jurisprudence in their absolute purity, freed from all entangling alliances of human life. Here were the logical instruments needed to manipulate and transform these concepts and to create and solve the most beautiful of legal problems. Here one found a dialectic hydraulic interpretation press, which could press an indefinite number of meanings out of any text of statute. Now Jhering continues, the boundless opportunities of this heaven of concepts were open to all properly qualified jurists, provided they drank the Lethen draught, which induced forgetfulness of terrestrial human affairs. But for the most accomplished jurist, the draught was entirely superfluous, for they had nothing to forget. See, Germans can tell jokes, right? So what Cohen is using this for, and probably what Jhering was saying, is that, of course, there's no heaven of legal concepts. It's a joke to make fun, right, as a contrast of a certain type of jurisprudence, because we cannot conceive of law outside of a social universe in which it governs. That's Cohen. I want to go back about a generation before to Oliver Wendell Holmes in a famous dissent. Holmes writes, the common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, but the articulate voice of some sovereign or quasi-sovereign that can be identified. This is a statement of what is known as legal positivism, in Germany, Hans Kelsen is sort of often associated with this, and says, look, law is not a thing that's out there, Holmes wrote in great prose, brooding out there in some like dark, mysterious force, but it always and can always be tied to some sovereign human actor who is making the law. So again, the image of the law in heaven is used here as a reductio ad absurdum, as a thing that cannot exist. And finally, Grant Gilmore. Grant Gilmore was a professor through the middle decades of the 20th century, ultimately ended his career in Yale, was a commercial lawyer, but also a legal theorist back when that combination was possible. Maybe hopefully here in Germany we could do that again. And at the end of his life, he writes a book called The Ages of American Law, in which he summarizes his life's work in a kind of short book that's meant for somewhat popular audiences. When I was in law school in the 90s, it was a kind of book that they told you to read the summer before starting law school to sort of orient you. And the very last paragraph of Gilmore's book closes as follows. The better the society, the less law there will be. In heaven, there will be no law, and the lion shall lie down with the lamb, of course a reference to Isaiah. The worse the society, the more law there will be. In hell, there'll be nothing but law, and due process will be meticulously observed. So Gilmore adds on and really builds on this tradition of Holmes and Cohen/Yering to say as follows, right? All law, well maybe we could summarize as follows, that the purpose of law is to govern society. That's what it's for. Law is made by a sovereign authority. It is not found by judges or scholars. You can't study law disaggregated from its application in a particular society or understand it unless you know how it impacts society. And then sort of what Gilmore adds, which is implicit in all this other, is law exists because humans are imperfect. In an ideal world, there will be no law. So I will call this little narrative here the law in heaven as described by 20th century Anglo-American legal theory, which means there is no law in heaven because the whole point of law is to govern here on earth. Now I want to contrast this with a Talmudic story, and I want to be very clear. A, this is not the only story about law in the Talmud, but I would say this is a story about law that only the Talmud can tell. Okay, so I want to hold that difference. Now, when we think of heaven, I think to me heaven is like a big white screen. And we project our ideas of perfection onto it, right? No one has been in heaven. Some of the biblical prophets think about it. But ultimately, I think both in ancient and modern life, it's a way of saying, what do I think is the ideal? What do I think is perfect? And it's in that mode that I want to look at this Talmudic story. So the Talmud Bava 86 starts with the following line. They were arguing in the Academy of Heaven. And I want to focus on the noun and then on the verb. Academy. Now, I'm not an art maven, but I've been schlepped by my wife Liz to enough museums. And in these museums, you inevitably, certainly in Europe, see hundreds, maybe thousands of artistic descriptions of heaven in one way or another. Often Christian, some reacting to, some continuing, etc. I don't think I've ever seen a description of heaven as an academy. I just want to pause there. This is an unusual thing to posit that exists in heaven. But now I want to focus on the verb. Even if there is an academy in heaven, what is the verb associated? Arguing. Right? If I ask most people what verb they associate with heaven, first they don't know, but maybe beatifying, or enlightening, or chilling, or some sort of very right? Guess what does heaven sound like? It's a soundtrack in an oncologist's office. right? It's the lyres, it's the lutes, it's very light, airy, fluffy, right? Think of some images of heaven. So if you go a little Christian, you'll think it looks like this. If you want to be more secular, you'll think this. If you want to think in a Jewish mode, you might come up with something like this. About a third of New Yorker cartoons play on heaven in one way or another. But to think that there's an academy in heaven seems very strange. And to think that there's an argument in heaven seems even stranger. Okay, so let's say I go, and I know the Vice Chancellor's here, right? What faculty is the Academy of Heaven? So usually people will say, I don't know, theology, or maybe metaphysics, or maybe like that part where physics sort of intersects with metaphysics and theology is string theory, right? There's a Schrodinger outside. Right? And if there is an academy in heaven, we're typically going to say that is that place where the grand questions of humanity are finally answered, or the grand questions of the universe are finally answered, right? Whatever department you think that is, I'm sure everyone's going to apply for grants now.
Life sciences.
Life sciences, right? We'll get to sort of neuroscience, right? But that place where the study is about like the essential it of what the world is about. We can call it philosophy, we can call it neuroscience, we can call it theology, we can call it physics, we can call it metaphysics. I think if I told you, if I convinced you that there is an academy in heaven, I think that's what we would assume is being studied there. So let's look at what the Talmud thinks. They're arguing in the Academy of Heaven. If there's a blotch on the skin preceded the white hair, he is impure. If the white hair preceded the blotch on the skin, he is pure. So apparently it's the faculty of dermatology. I don't think that was on anyone's list, right? Even though in America, dermatologist is like the hardest residency to get into. Okay, what is going on here? So this is, if you know a little bit about rabbinic law, this is actually a Mishnah from Tractate Negaim, which has to do with what in English is poorly translated as leprosy. In Hebrew, tzarat. This is sort of the middle chapters of the book of Leviticus. It spends a lot of airspace discussing this disease that one gets, some skin malady, that then one goes to the priest for a certain type of purification process. And then there are these rules, right? That, well, if the blotch on the skin precedes the white hair, that's a problem. You have this malady. And if the opposite is true, you don't. Now, I'm going to pause here for a minute. To say that this is going on in the Academy of Heaven, so I've never been, but I'm pretty sure that in heaven there are no physical bodies. And yet, the topic that the Talmud chooses to put in the Academy of Heaven is one that is very physical and about a body. But I want to go further. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what causes this disease. But the rabbis say it is caused by what they call lashon hara, which is something like evil speech or gossiping or sort of unwanted talebearing. In other words, a sinner. So here we are in our Academy in Heaven discussing a spiritual deformation which causes a physical deformation, when presumably there is neither physical form nor spiritual deformation in heaven. And I think this is on purpose. In other words, the Talmud's understanding is that what is being discussed in heaven is the thing most about earth, i.e. least about what could possibly be in heaven. But now let's go further. If there is doubt as to which came first, remember we had one rule if the blotch comes before the hair. We have another rule if the hair comes before the blotch. But what if you don't know? So now, notice that in heaven, there is doubt. So there are arguments, there are doubts, and now look at the debate. So the Holy One, blessed is He, that's how they say God, says He's pure. Okay, so apparently God is in the Academy of Heaven. Now I suspect that most people would think that it looks something like this, where God is on top, and sort of, medieval pictures always do better, right? And it's sort of speaking to the disciples who are soaking up the divine wisdom. But of course, it's not what the Talmud says. The Holy One, blessed be He, that is pure, and the rest of the Academy, don't know who that is, but it's not God, say He's impure. And then, maybe the most audacious part, that's who's going to adjudicate this case. All right, you got God over here. You got the rest of the Academy over here. Oh. Now in America we say somebody got called up to the big leagues. It was decided that Rabbi Bar Nachmani would decide, and the rest of the story says how the angel of death went to get him and to bring him to adjudicate this case. Now I want to sort of summarize what we saw and see just how many conventions about what law is, and maybe what law isn't, are baked into the story. First, we see that law exists even in the ideal heavenly state. In other words, whereas Gilmore was convinced that in heaven there's no law, you only need law in hell, the rabbis say, of course there's law in heaven. Not only that, typically when we think about law, we immediately think of courts. Right? If you ask someone, draw me a mental image of law, they're going to get the big columns, the sort of neoclassical building of the court, or Lady Justice, right, who's weighing and balancing. But notice here, maybe it's fitting for a law school, that the ideal law is an academy. Is a place where it's just where the ideas of law are discussed, not the case of adjudication. Also note that in our heavenly ideal, law can contain factual doubt. Right? We don't know which came first, the hair or the blotch. And notice that that factual doubt generates legal doubt. What is the rule when you don't know which came first? The ideal law contains disagreement. God says one thing, everyone else says something else. Now in America, and probably in Germany too, we'll say, oh, this area of the law is like, it's a negative thing to say that the laws disagree. Right? Ideally the law is clear. What can you do? This court says that, this court says that. But here, the heavenly law is baked into a disagreement. Finally, to sum up the other things we said, the law can be considered even beyond its application. Right? There is no physically deformed body generated by a spiritual deformation in heaven. The whole point of heaven is the opposite of that, and yet that is what they choose to discuss. And then finally, to the extent we think of God as the sovereign of the law here exists in some ways outside the sovereign, because God has an opinion about the law, maybe even a very good opinion about the law, but is not definitive of the law. So to me, this image is the exact opposite of the Anglo-American, but I suspect just the modern legal tradition as a whole, because it, of course written a long time ago, but it almost intentionally subverts every assumption we make about what law is and what law is for. And I want to push on that. Now, I want to fast forward from the Heavenly Academy to suburban New York, probably 10 years ago. I'm going to show you a sign that was posted in the synagogue where I happened to be one Shabbat. We're going to do a little interpretation of the sign. Okay, so first you'll notice it's Art Deco. I don't have a good explanation for why that is, but it is. Okay, so let's here focus here. Anyone knows this is in a place called Lawrence, New York, in the Five Towns sort of well-known Jewish community near Kennedy Airport, just the sort of logo. All right, and the top it tells us that it's on a certain Shabbat. We'll see why that's important in a minute. You see it's the winter because unlike here where it ended at 11 o'clock, here it ends at basically 5 o'clock. But let's focus on the speaker, and most importantly, the title of the speaker. The speaker is Rabbi Eliyahu Levine, a fairly well-known person from, and he is described as the Rosh Kollel of the Lakewood Kollel Choshen Mishpat. Rosh Kollel we can think of as like, maybe something like chair in, or department chair, or head of a program. Okay, Choshen Mishpat is the civil law, right, the commercial business civil law part of Jewish law. And Lakewood is one of the most well-known yeshivas in the world, and certainly in the United States. So if I were to translate this into the American vernacular, we would say this is the, white and case professor of corporate law at Harvard Law School. That is the rough analogy. Now, let's see what he's talking about. Okay, they translate this is a taboo topic, bidding competitively on goods or properties when others are previously involved. In the common law, we would call this tortious interference with contract. Maybe the professors will say what this is in German. All right, this is like pretty technical stuff. Now, if I told you that there's a well-known scholar coming to talk about tortious interference with contract, you would say, oh, this must be a law school. Or maybe like a CLE, continuing legal education for lawyers. And you would say this is taking place amongst people who practice in this area for whom this is important. Now you'll notice this was on Shabbat. And if you know very little about the laws of Shabbat, you know that you don't do business on Shabbat. And yet the topic here was business law in its very core. Now I went. This is my world. I'm a contract law professor. I actually do this for fun. But I'm weird. So there was about 100 people there. I don't want to say there were no lawyers. There were lawyers. But no lawyers that practiced this. And mostly just members of the community who came to learn. And I said, in what other setting can you imagine that a community group or a church says, hey, we want people to come. We're going to have a lecture on tortious interference of contract by this bigwig from the law school. And you guys need a new program director. But what is happening here? Now, so at one level, what is happening here is obviously not law in the sense that Cohen and Gilmore and Holmes would be talking about, because this as a cultural practice makes no sense. Now, I've been hiding a little bit, or been obscuring a concept, and that's a concept that I want to spend the second half of the talk talking about. What's happening here is that these people, and this lecture, is itself a sort of model of this Talmudic academy, of the idea that in Rabbinic Judaism called Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. Now, the study of Torah is a kind of weird thing, because it posits that the study of Jewish law, both in its practical parts, but also in its rather impractical or not practiced or theoretical parts, is not only important, but in some traditions is the pinnacle of divine service. So, see, law school, we are the factory. I keep on telling this to my dean, I should get a raise. Now, this is a very strange thing, and I think helps us because we don't, right? Our view in general is that lawyers may need to know law, that nobody else needs to, and no one does it for spiritual edification or spiritual purposes. And yet, one of the things the rabbis understood, which is very familiar in one hand to anyone who grows up in a Jewish, strictly and observant environment, but strange if you just stop back and think about it, is why is and how is the study of law given this central role that even when we imagine heaven, that's what we imagine happening, and we're going to bring 200, 100 people on a Saturday afternoon for spiritual enlightenment to discuss the very interesting topic of tortious interference. Now, I think to make sense of this, we know a little bit about another strange feature of Jewish law, which is its connection to sovereignty. So usually, when we think of what makes legal systems grow and develop and what makes them interesting and important is usually connected to the underlying political base of that community. So in the 19th century, people studied English law, people studied German law, people studied Spanish law. Those were the big legal systems of government, because those were the empires of the 19th century. As their social and political influence spread, so did the study of law. The 20th century, obviously American law, the earlier half Soviet law. Today, I'm sure there are courses in the law school on Chinese law, on Indian law, right, on EU law, of course. So in other words, the greater the death of EU law, the greater the social and political basis of the legal system, the more it grows, the more it develops, the more people are invested in it. Something very strange in that sense happens with Jewish law. The Mishnah, the foundational document of what we call the oral law, doesn't really come into form until after the destruction of the temple and the Second Commonwealth. In other words, once the political basis of the society has disappeared. Some scholars would go even further and say that Jewish law emerges as a response to the loss of political sovereignty. So right away, we have this gap, or this difference between what usually creates and promotes law and the way the rabbis do it, which is almost the opposite. The second feature is this idea of Torah study, which applies to all forms of law, both very practical things like the laws of Shabbat, the laws of kosher, and anything anyone would identify with Jewish life, but also to things that are either wholly not practiced because the temple doesn't exist, the Jewish monarchy doesn't exist, all the institutions of Jewish law, or are sort of somewhere in between, things like tortious interference of contract or other sorts of issues that we're out in the civil system and we have all sorts of ways in which we interact. And this idea of Torah study doesn't really distinguish between them. In fact, in a certain way, in certain yeshivas, the best Torah study is about the things that are least practical. Law schools have a little bit of this too, right? You always love the constitutional law. No one wants to start studying the commercial code. So what is that all about? Now I think the key to this is to understand that while the word for Jewish law is halakha, which we'll translate for now as Jewish law, the concept of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, is broader than that. And this word Torah, though in the New Testament they would translate it as law, it really means something more like teaching, specifically God's teaching. And I think one of the rabbi's innovations is that what it means for the law to apply is not only that people carry it out, though that's obviously important, but that it stands as a normative idea within a system of thought that is studied, analyzed, cross-referenced. And that foundational concepts are always baked into legal ideas. The rabbis were not great philosophers. They were not great theorists. In fact, there's no word for theory in classical rabbinic Hebrew. Nothing that the rabbis write is philosophical. More than that, nothing is really written. It's all orally taught for 1,000 years. And it simply doesn't have the structure, the tone, the tenor of anything we might think of as philosophical. Now this is interesting because in the pre-rabbinic era, writers like Philo of Alexandria, writers like Josephus, write in a key that we wouldn't call modern writing, but very sort of similar to the way ancient peoples thought about philosophical ideas. At the end of the rabbinic period, in the 10th, 11th century, you began to see writers, Jewish writers, write philosophically. But for the period we call the rabbis, let's say 200 to 800 or whatever, no such thing exists. It is all interpretive devices. And that's what I want to explore, how that works. Because what I want to show is that, and what I think is what makes sense of this practice of Torah study, is that through the study of the law is the way these ideas are expressed. They took legal concepts and they embedded them not only with what we would think of law in a narrow sense, but with this far broader set of ideas. In other words, law becomes the medium through which rabbis discuss things. And because they held Jewish law at such a high level of regard, almost anything important that they wanted to say became and was enmeshed in Jewish law. So I want to give an example of this before we go. So this example, we need to start with the Bible. The Bible, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, says, what do you do when you find a dead body, a murdered body, a victim, and you don't know who the murderer is? So the Bible sets out a procedure. It says, look, if you find someone slain in the field, and you don't know who murdered him, what's supposed to happen? The elders and the judges go out and measure to the city closest to the slain. And the elders of the town, then they take a heifer, which is a cow, they break its neck. The term wash our hands of the blood comes from here. They wash their hands ceremonially and saying, we are not responsible for this. This is the biblical rule. Maimonides explains this in a fairly rational, functional way. He says, look, what are you after? You go and you find a murdered victim, and there's no public response. So we need to engage the body politic and bring the judges and the elders, and the Talmud understands this means the judges of like the Supreme Court, to engage in this sort of laborious process to say which city must take responsibility for this. Okay, let's run with that. Now, I want you to look at what the Mishnah says. And if anyone's familiar with the Pauline critique of the rabbis, it is, you guys are just law-obsessed, and you just focus on little details, and you miss the point. And I don't know if this Mishnah was around when Paul was, or whether Paul knew of this Mishnah, but if I were his research assistant, I would say, we got one for you. Okay, so on this process, here's what happens. If the corpse, his head, was found in one place, and the remainder of the body in another place. Okay, so now we're imagining that our slain victim has the head chopped off clean. And the head's over here, and the body's over here. And what's our problem? Where do we measure from? So, rabbis debate this. So they would bring the head to the body, according to Rabbi Lezer. You pick up the head, you come, you put it on the body, now we can measure. And Rabbi Akiva says, no. We're going to drag the body and the head, and now we measure. Now, in case this wasn't graphic enough for you, they say, okay, fine, but which part of the body do they measure from? Rabbi Lezer says from the navel. Rabbi Akiva says from his nostrils. Now, I ask you, if this is law, in the sense of like a governing structure, well, we've had a lot to drink here, right? And again, this is exactly what Paul would say, my gosh, what are you talking about? Any fans of Scandinavian TV? I know we're not so far from Scandinavia. Any fans of Scandinavian TV? Anyone hear the show The Bridge? So the premise of the show is that there is a dead body found exactly on the border between Denmark and Sweden, I forgot the name of the long famous bridge, and this becomes a police procedural, like film noir, Scandinavian film noir, where it's a whole question, and of course, you know, it puts the Danish officer and the Swedish officer in different personalities, and somebody's like, okay, but if you're not such a fan of this, like, what are we talking about? I go further. You know what the Talmud doesn't talk about? Where in the city do you measure to? Do you measure to the town square, to the top, to the bottom? Right? There's like no discussion of that. And yet, so I'm pretty short, so we'll call it 18 inches. If you're tall, maybe it's 2 feet. The 24 inches between the navel and the body, that becomes a very important thing to discuss. So I think as long as this is farce at best. Now, I want to look at what the Talmud does, which I don't think you have to read or can read every statement in the Talmud like this, but as a possibility. The Talmud says, what are they talking about? Let's take a look. What are they arguing about? And this follows. So Rabbi Akiva says, because remember, Rabbi Akiva was the guy who said, you're going to drag the body to the head, and you're going to measure from the nostrils. And he says, the primary element of life is in the nostrils. where Rabbi Eliezer says the primary element of life is in the name. Now, I think what happens here is the Talmud switches the register of the type of discussion we're having. Right? When you look at the Mishnah, it's like we're talking about inches or centimeters. Here, this gets transformed into a question that I think is a version of a question that every society asks itself in one way or another, which is, what is special about the human? So in the Middle Ages, this would have been tagged as a theological question. Right? Maybe in the 20th century, 21st century, we would call this life sciences, right? We put scans on people's brains and try to figure out, like, where is consciousness? Today, AI is making us think, well, what is human? What is its core? I think this is the Talmud's way of engaging this question. Anatomically, humans look a lot like animals. From the navel, it's a version of a mammal. And maybe that's how we ought to relate to this. But the nostrils, what verse do you think is tickling in the back of their heads, of Rabbi Akiva's head when he says the nostrils? Genesis, God blew the life force in through the nose. Now, why is this? Because remember, if you're driving on a road and you pass by an animal that's very small, you won't even notice. If it's a big animal, you'll swerve and say, ew, gross. But a human, you're supposed to stop, engage the public, right? Today we, at the very least, call the police, and say, wait, how did this happen? That, of course, begs the question, why is the human different? For the Talmud, the law becomes a medium to have that discussion. Now, this is a very short example, a very extreme example, but what I want you to see is how the register shifts from inches to what we might think of as a philosophical question, a theological question, maybe a neurobiological question, however one phrases it. And from here, rabbinic interpreters use this to begin to have their version of that conversation. What makes it unique or uniquely Jewish is that it's never asked in the abstract, but it's always connected to this particular point of law. So that the law here has like this telescoping possibility where it's anchored in something very concrete and it ends in something very, very different. And it's very hard to figure out where one ends and one begins. So therefore, when I think of Jewish law, I think about it as having basically two poles. There's a way, and I put magnets there because I think if we think of the system as a whole, each one has a gravitational force. On the one hand, it is law in a fairly typical way. It's not state law, but it's still a law that communities organize themselves and has a certain sort of political valence about law-keeping, law-abiding, and law enforcement. But it also has, and I would say that's the halacha as law pole. But it also has a counterpole. And that is this idea of Torah, of instruction, where the study is not practical, but devotional. I think the reason that Torah study becomes so central is because the rabbis wanted, ideally, that one engage at both ends of this spectrum. I want to end with just a few more quick examples of this. If we ask, right, every religion asks, what books of the Bible are canonical? How does the Talmud engage this question? Well, if there's a house burning on Shabbat, and there's a bunch of scrolls in there, which ones can you save? And of course, the ones you can save are the ones considered canonical. The ones you can't save are not. So it never, at least not here, asks it directly, what do we consider holy? It's always, there's a legal question that then spawns and creates this other question of what's in the canon. You know, if you think of Kantian virtue ethics, right? Must one always tell the truth? Or are white lies permitted? That's a question that, again, every society is going to ask in its way. The Talmud has this as follows. You're at a wedding. You're supposed to praise the bride and groom. So do you tell the bride the truth? Well, you know, you're okay, and you've got some pros and you've got some cons. That's the opinion of Beit Shammai. The opinion of Beit Hillel is, no, every bride is wonderful on that day at least. Again, it's even a song. Signet weddings, before the bride. But what's behind that is that they're asking a question that we could describe as a virtue ethics question, but not that way, always through what action shall I take? So now the question is, not literally what you do, although maybe, but also like how you're supposed to think about it. Therefore, the question with the bridge, right, or the question with the body, it's silly to think about it as, oh, the point of this is what happens if I happen to find a body? No, clearly it's a way to inspire thought on this. To talk about legal theory, right, so most legal theory starts with, well, what is the role of the court? What is the authority of the court? Can the court get the law wrong? Does the law exist in the courts? The court says it. Right? Or is the law pre-existing, the court doesn't declare it? What is the role of social acceptance? If no one accepts the court's ruling, does it valid? All of those questions are asked in Talmud, but not as legal theory, but ironically as a question of sacrificial procedure. Why? There's a sacrifice you're supposed to bring if the high court makes a mistake. The legal theory is never direct, it's always around and roundabout, asking, well, what if no one accepted the ruling? What if someone there was dissenting? And through that is the way that the rabbis are engaging in these questions, that at least in the academy today, we would identify as legal theory. So I'll end with what is really the thesis of this book that I wrote, that I think the rabbi's most important contribution to law is not actually the articulation of any specific rule, but the centrality accorded to its study. By legislating Torah study, Halakha requires a Jew to not only obey the law, but to construct the worldview through it. The goal is not only to be the subject of regulation, but the accuracy of its internal dialogue through which these broader questions are accessed, always through the medium of the legal command anchored in the divine word. Thank you very much.
Wir haben soeben einen faszinierenden und humorvollen Vortrag gehört, der uns intellektuell tief bewegt hat. Ein solcher Moment verlangt nach aufrichtigem Dank. My first and most special thanks go to our keynote speaker today, Professor Dr. Chaim Seiman. Dear Professor Seiman, you have taken upon yourself the long journey from the United States to be with us today. Thank you very much for that. With your remarks today, you have struck at the very heart of what we aim to achieve with the Hildesheimer lectures. Namely, to demonstrate how legal concepts from the halakha can contribute to current discussions and enrich them through an entirely different and fresh perspective. In your lecture, you masterfully described how halakha can be understood as an interplay of rules and expressive discourse. You showed us how Talmudic scholars have spent nearly 2,000 years utilizing legal frameworks to negotiate topics that other cultures primarily locate within philosophy, theology, ethics, or even literature and art. Today you have impressively brought to light that Talmudic law, unlike Western abstract philosophy, does not seek static truths. Rather, halakha derives the divine precisely through the dynamic details of concrete everyday life. You have shown us that Jewish law is a vibrant, existential cultural space. Thank you so much for this profound insight. Ein solch hochkarätiges Ereignis wie der Hildesheimer Vortrag ist jedoch niemals das Werk einzelner Personen. Es lebt von starken Partnerschaften. Daher gilt mein herzlicher Dank den Berliner Studien zum jüdischen Recht unter der langjährigen bewährten Leitung von Professor Dr. Heger. Lieber Herr Professor Heger, Sie leiten diese Institution nun schon seit Jahren mit unermüdlichem Engagement. Sie sind unser maßgeblicher Mitstreiter in der Organisation des Hildesheimer Vortrages und tun immer alles Menschenmögliche damit diese Vortragsreihe Jahr für Jahr stattfinden kann. Ohne ihre Tatkraft stünden wir heute nicht hier. Ebenso schätzen wir uns glücklich, die akademische Heimat dieses Vortrages so stark besetzt zu wissen. Wir danken dem Vizepräsidenten der Humboldt-Universität, Niels Hildesheimer, sowie dem Dekan der Juristischen Fakultät, Professor Dr. Philipp Dann, dass Sie heute hier mit uns zusammen sind und gekommen sind. Vielen Dank. Dank Ihnen wird der Hildesheimer Vortrag auch von seitens der HU auf so hohem Niveau mit so viel Nachdruck unterstützt und gefördert. Diese Verbundenheit ehrt uns sehr. Ein weiterer unverzichtbarer Pfeiler dieser Veranstaltung sind der Bund Traditioneller Juden Deutschlands und der Zentralrat der Juden. Sie unterstützen diesen Vortrag nun ebenfalls seit vielen Jahren und haben sich allgemein zu einem überaus wichtigen und verlässlichen Partner des Rabbinerseminars entwickelt. Für diese treue Weggemeinschaft danke ich Ihnen von Herzen. Zum Ende meiner Worte möchte ich den Blick nach innen richten. Ein ganz persönlicher und tiefer Dank gilt Rabbiner Yeshua Spinner, dem Visionär des Rabbinerseminars und dieser Vortragsreihen und selbstverständlich dem Managementteam des Rabbinerseminars unter der exzellenten Leitung von Frau Sarah Celebrinski. Vielen Dank. Ich möchte diese Gelegenheit auch nutzen, um einem Freund und Kollegen herzlich zur Erlangung der Doktorwürde zu gratulieren. Lieber Dr. Fabian, lieber Dani, wenn man die hebräische Abkürzung von Rabbiner Doktor nimmt, dann entsteht das Wort Radar. Möge der Ewige dich segnen, weiterhin den Überblick wie ein Radar über alles zu behalten. Lassen Sie mich diese Dankesrede mit einem kurzen Gedanken schließen, der gut zu Professor Simons Vortrag passt. Wenn wir über das jüdische Recht sprechen, nutzen wir das Wort Halacha. Linguistisch stammt dieser Begriff bekanntlich von der hebräischen Wurzel für gehen, lalechet. Denn Halacha bedeutet niemals Stillstand. Sie bedeutet nicht in einem starren, dogmatischen Regelwerk zu verharren. Halacha bedeutet Dynamik. Es ist der Weg, den wir gehen, Schritt für Schritt, im ständigen Dialog mit der Welt, mit der Moderne und mit der Menschheit als Ganzes. Und genau diesen dynamischen, lebensnahen Zugang finden wir beim Namensgeber dieser Vortragsreihe selbst, Dr. Ezriel Hildesheimer. Für Rabbiner Hildesheimer war die Halacha niemals eine weltfremde Theorie, die man im Elfenbeinturm einschließt. Er forderte leidenschaftlich, dass das jüdische Gesetz aktiv in die Gegenwart hineinwirkt und sich mit der modernen Wissenschaft wie auch den aktuellen Fragen der Gesellschaft auseinandersetzen muss. Das Gesetz bewahrt seine Heiligkeit nicht durch Abschottung, sondern indem es uns Kraft gibt, im Hier und Jetzt, dynamisch, relevant und voller Leben. Der heutige Abend hat gezeigt, wie lebendig dieser Weg ist. Ich danke Ihnen allen für Ihr Kommen, für Ihr Mitgehen auf diesem Weg und wünsche Ihnen noch wunderbare, inspirierende Gespräche während des Buffets, welches hiermit eröffnet ist. Vielen Dank.